The Call of the Breach, Part 5.
DisastrousInvolvedI.
Disclaimer: the content presented in this video is purely fictional and intended for entertainment purposes only.
The walk up to the white clapboard church that stood in the center of the fortress was lined with dozens of armed men from New Wilderness, rifles at the ready. A large crowd had gathered outside, which the guards held at bay to search each person before letting them through, often to the annoyance of the citizens in question. More soldiers, these from Ark River's forces, stood in a large unbroken line around the church itself, rifles across their backs, carrying the ornately forged spears and carved wooden shields their kind were known for. They all saluted as we passed the various lines of security, though little enthusiasm gleamed behind their weary eyes. Everyone wanted this to be over. For some resolution to bring our tiny camp together, but no one quite knew how. If our enemies could see us, oh how they'd laugh. We handed our weapons off to the machine gun squad that guarded the front entrance, and as both doors to the sanctuary creaked open, I bit back a reflexive gasp. The Ark River Church of Redemption had always been a mystical, incredible place, almost too beautiful for a simple countryside chapel. Gorgeous stained glass windows decorated the walls to cast streams of colorful light down onto the long floorboards during the day. Carvings were etched on the various pews that now lined the walls, removed long ago from their customary rows in the center of the room for the sizable congregation to sit side by side on the floor during worship. Animals and birds, plants and landscapes from another time all adorned the old wooden benches in the Christian lore of the creation of the world, to end with the first man and woman walking hand in hand into the sunset. Candles burned in various facets on the walls or in tall candelabras in corners, and it gave the entire room a warm yellow hue, with a large crucifix in the front of the room overlooking it all. There in the doorframe, my eyes connected with the letters carved into the wooden cross, the indentations painted with metallic golden lacquer so that it glowed in the candlelight. I still didn't know where I stood on religion, but this place always took my breath away for its sheer presence. And that name burned itself into my mind like a shimmering meteor in the sky. Daring to stare at it a moment longer, I let my timid guard down and reached out inside my head with a silent plea to the great unknown, Adonai. They say you're a God of mercy. If that's true, I could use your help right about now. Hey. A hand touched my shoulder to jolt me from the trance, and I felt my face grow hot with embarrassment as Ethan directed me out of the doorway so more people could step inside. We took our places at opposite tables in the front of the hall, the only two such things in the room, both made of simple pine construction. Chris already waited for me at ours, and it hit me as I sat down on the rigid handmade chair that we were the only ones seated as the defense. Seeming to read my mind, Chris made a grim half-smile. I'll do most of the talking, and I'll be right here if they ask you to speak. No matter what happens, you have to stay calm, okay? We don't want to encourage any kind of outbursts from the crowd. People filled in the seats along the walls, and large mats had been laid out in the back for those who didn't get a bench to sit on. I doubted we'd be able to fit everyone into a building smaller than my high school auditorium, but it seemed there'd be a few hundred packed in here at least. More rangers stalked the aisles, guiding people to fill in the empty seats, and cordoning off the chairs arrayed at the front of the room. The center held more rugs and mats. Only the front half left open for the proceedings. Ark River denizens sat on one side of the hall, New Wilderness on the other, and I suspected this was as much to keep peace as it was to distribute the crowd swarming through the front doors. A sickened knot twisted in my stomach, and I wrapped both arms around myself, tan winter jacket still on over my uniform despite the rising temperature. In this lighting, I noted how the silver tattoos on my right wrist seemed to stand out even more and had little doubt that the lines on my face were gleaming like a beacon. Multiple people from the crowd gawked at me, pointing, murmuring, even giggling. Without my gun I felt naked, but having the scars of my mutation on display, even if all they could see was the marks on my face, made me want to melt through the floorboards. Unable to escape their curious eyes, I chewed at my lip and tried not to look around. Maybe I can go hide in the latrine for just 5. No sooner had the though entered my head, and the arched brown door in the front of the room that lead to the parsonage opened. Adam Sterling strode into the room, his wife Eve at his side. As leaders of the congregation and inheritors of their ancient namesake, they held supreme power over the fortress to which we were guests. It had been Adam who came first to Ark River, and upon discovering how to convert puppets to humans, he'd set about building the walls to protect his newfound family. Eve had been instrumental in the fort's survival, her natural abilities and intuition allowing her to tame the bone-faced whitetail they rode like horses, discern poisonous breech-made plants from edible ones, and tending to new converts with serene kindness. In this moment, however, they walked together to ornate wooden chairs that had been set facing the room in front of the pulpit, Adam's made of dark-stained oak, Eve's of light-finished pine. They both wore white garments in the pseudo-medieval fashion the Ark River folk loved so much, him a tunic and trousers, her a long dress that came to her ankles. Both were barefooted, Eve's honey-colored hair woven into a long braid that streamed from a circlet of polished silver atop her ears. And Adam wore a similar band on his short-cropped head. The metal had been forged to look like branches from a tree, the leaves so finely crafted as to shine like mirrors in the candlelight, doubtless another example of the extraordinary skill of their blacksmiths. No swords hung by their hips, though Adam carried a large, dark leather-bound book which I guessed to be a copy of the Holy Bible along with a sheaf of white papers, and Eve bore a small wooden mallet in her hand to serve as a gavel. Their faces were stern, and with their free hands, they clung to each other, pale fingers entwined in resolute union. Upon reaching their seats, Adam and Eve set their items down on a small table between the chairs and faced the crowd. Everyone fell into a reverent silence, and from where I sat, couldn't help but undergo a shiver of uncanny wonder. Likely it had been at their people's own insistence that the crowns had been made, but I had to admit, it was a spectacular sight. With the complete lack of any modern lights, the rows of armored guards that flanked the onlookers, and the sweeping beauty of the room itself, the entire scene gave me goosebumps for how similar it was to pictures I had seen in an older copy of The Lord of the Rings at my high school library, from Lost in the Woods, to leaders of the civilized world. If any of us survive all this, our grandchildren will think we were in league with elves or something. All hail the King and Queen of the Southlands. Up the center aisle in the main hall, Sean Hammond, Ethan Sanderson, and Sandra Abernathy marched in solemn procession to take up their spots at the table to the left of Chris and I. As leaders of the other factions in our fledgling assembly, they were the prosecution, and my heart sank at the way they didn't look our way, as if they couldn't bring themselves to meet our eyes. I call into session this, the first court of our age. Adam laid the Bible on the table in front of him, and laced both hands behind his back, a stern expression on his face as his eyes panned the entire crowd. Long ago, our kind was thrust from paradise because of disobedience. One that doomed all creation. Ever since then, the path of justice has been a hard but necessary one, in light of our debt to God as sinful creatures. It is in the shadow of that debt that we stand today. At those words, he and Eve turned to face the wooden cross behind them at the front of the room, and they both knelt. Each took off their silver crowns and placed them at the foot of the crucifix with a bow of their heads, and I noted how the Ark River half of the room seemed to get the cue to join hands in prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, with the words rising on the air from the multitude, the new wilderness side caught on, and either bowed their heads to join, or simply waited in silent respect. Not knowing enough about religious things to know all the words they spoke, I simply sat there with my head bowed, hoping that if there was a God out there, that he didn't completely hate Jamie Lonson. The prayer concluded, and Adam helped his wife to her feet, the two of them circling round their chairs to sit at last. With a tap of his gavel, Adam nodded at the back of the room. "Bring in the prisoner." Both doors swung open with a clack of the metal latches, and a squad of rangers advanced, to which the crowd erupted in a cacophony of emotion, hisses, boos, shouts and jeers flew at her like arrows, but in between the four guards, Jamie walked with her chin held high, though there was no joy or pride on her face. She had a pair of steel handcuffs on her wrists, and the blackened metal stood in sharp contrast to her sheet-white skin, enough that I could see her tremble ever so slightly. A few people tried to get closer but were kept back by the multiple rangers in the room, and I felt my heart twinge in pain at the words that echoed through the already stuffy air: murderer, liar, traitor. Within minutes, a few hecklers were thrown to the ground to be hauled out in cuffs, as they couldn't help but try and jump the cordon to get at her. The worst of the behavior seemed to come from the new wilderness side of the room, but I couldn't miss the frowns of disdain from a few of the Ark River folk. Clearly, they didn't think much of our conduct in their holy place, and while I couldn't blame them for that, more than one churchgoer narrowed their golden eyes at Jamie with obvious contempt. It was a madhouse, and only the constant hammering of Adam's gavel brought some level of calm back to the room. "Jamie Belladonna Lonson," he spoke with a graveness to his voice that sent chills through me, and at his side, Eve looked on with a stoic impassivity that made my spirits fail. They were some of the kindest, warmest, most forgiving people I'd ever known, and to see them regard Jamie with such coldness only drove home the reality of Chris's words: someone has to pay the price. You stand accused of conspiracy to commit arson, theft, trading in defense secrets, conspiring with the enemy, and espionage in a time of war. Adam shuffled his papers and went on, the charges moving into a second page of valuable white stock. You also charged with hampering the investigation into the murder of 2 Ark River soldiers, aiding in the deaths of those killed in the October rocket attack, as well as human trafficking, kidnapping, and high treason. In the face of these charges, how do you plead? The guards placed Jamie on a mat before the 2 judges' seats, in front of the defense and prosecution tables, so that she sat on her knees with both chained wrists in her lap. From where she knelt, Jamie didn't even raise her head, both defeated green irises on the manacles on her wrists. Guilty. No, damn it, Lonson. Chris growled under his breath, but didn't seem at all surprised by her actions. Myself, I whirled to look at the prosecution table in astonishment. It didn't make any sense. How were we supposed to defend her if Jamie openly admitted to being guilty? How were they all so calm about it? What on earth had I missed? I wanted to scream, to jump up and run to her. To beg, plead, even threaten anyone who would listen, but I couldn't move. It seemed as if my blood had become lead, and all I could do was sit there, fighting a cascade of hot salty tears that brimmed my eyes as the spectacle unfolded in front of me. He blinked down at Jamie from where she sat, a moderate form of surprise across her angelic face. You confess to these crimes? Jamie at last did look up at them both and nodded. I do, Your Honor. You do understand the seriousness of this? Adam leaned forward, and something in his eyes flickered with a look close to pity, as if he hated being a judge as much as Jamie hated being the defendant. Treason has only one punishment. As commanded by God. Betrayal of this magnitude demands a death sentence. My muscles twitched in a spasm of despair, but Chris's hand clamped down on my arm to keep me still. Easy. He whispered, his face set in a tired wince. You have to trust me on this. Let me handle it. With that, Chris stood from the defendant's table and strode out into the center beside Jamie. Actually, Your Honor, the defense objects to the insinuation that Jamie alone bears responsibility for these charges. Adam waved for him to continue and reclined in his chair with a raised eyebrow. Please, explain. Chris turned to face the assembly, a bead of nervous sweat on his forehead, but retained his cool assurance despite it. While it is true that Jamie participated in much of the previously mentioned crimes, it should be noted that their chief architect was none other than Dr. Alicia O'Brien, who operated as an undercover spy for Elsa, and pressured Jamie into helping her during a moment of supreme vulnerability. Such as? From her pine throne, Eve cocked her head to one side in intrigue. Chris seemed to stumble over his words for a moment. I'm sorry? She gestured to Jamie, and Eve's brow furrowed in confusion. This supreme vulnerability you speak of. If what you say is true, it must have been drastic to influence her to commit such heinous acts. What, exactly, was she vulnerable to? Jamie gnawed at her lower lip. And Chris swiveled his head to look my way. Grief. The sanctuary hummed with discontented murmurs, and I did my best not to slide lower in my seat, my face on fire. Well, he's got their attention now. Anyway, back in his stride once again, Chris walked in a circle around Jamie, as if a moving shield to protect her from their angry whispers. It was only after Vesitorak ambushed our convoy that Jamie fell into Dr. O'Brien's employ. Hannah had been badly wounded, and since they were close friends, Jamie didn't want to see her die. Loyalty in this instance is the motivation for Jamie's actions, not criminal intent. And yet her actions led to the deaths of innocent people. Adam sighed and rubbed his brow wearily. Good intentions do not absolve someone of bad outcomes. Miss Brunn was tortured by Elsa, and while we thank God for her recovery under their hands, such a risky gamble could have easily ended in tragedy. What kind of person sells their friend into slavery? The kind of person who would rather see her friend have a chance to live than to die in a horrible way. Chris swept both arms around himself at shoulder level to gesture at the crowd. Look around you. Ark River stands because you took a chance, Your Honor. These people in your congregation, they wouldn't be here if you didn't take a risky gamble. Did Hannah deserve less of a chance than any of them? A smile tried to flit across my face, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to suppress it. Chris had undersold his abilities as Jamie's defense, and part of me was beginning to hope this might actually work. Adam and Eve exchanged uncertain looks from their lofty seats, Adam the most affected, though Eve's golden irises settled on Jamie with a renewed light of pity. Even amongst the crowd, doubt overtook some of the former hatred in the faces of the people, the murmurs not all indignant, and more than a few seemed somewhat calmer than before. For her own part, Jamie still had her head bowed to avoid meeting the eyes of everyone in the room, but I could see her ears perk up in curious desperation. We can do this. Chris knows his stuff, and the people already love him. We can get Jamie acquitted. I know we can. Seeming to share my anticipation, Chris pressed his advantage before they could respond and turned to address the jury directly. I know everyone here has experienced loss, whether of loved ones or possessions. So much has been taken from you, so much blood spilled, but I ask you, is more blood the answer? Jamie did what any one of us would have done to save someone we love, and tell that to the kids the rockets dropped on. One of the men in the crowd shouted, and all at once, the assembly went off again, roars of various kinds tearing back and forth in the bedlam, stunned at the dramatic shift. I craned my head from my chair to watch the two sides of the hall explode with noise, Ark River finally losing their patience with new wilderness, and each tried to shout down the other. Objects soared through the air, people even flung their shoes, and yet more spectators were hauled away by the red-faced guards. Adam hammered with his gavel, but it took longer to quiet the crowds, and the rangers worked overtime to carry more angry people away by the collar. It seemed rage flowed faster than any goodwill Chris could sow, and my former optimism faded with it. There was no reasoning with these people, they weren't rational, logical, coherent. It struck me once more that, each in their own way, both Rodney Carter and Dr. O'Brien had been correct. Society was a sea of fools, emotional, unstable fools, who would tear each other apart if we didn't force them to get along at gunpoint. It didn't matter what Jamie, Chris, or I had done in the service of New Wilderness. Our own people were ready to crucify Jamie then and there, simply out of pent-up hate. 2 revolutions. I've helped to stop 2 revolutions, and what did it get me? I'll watch these beasts kill my best friend, all because they can't control their enough? Sean's voice boomed through the room like a clap of thunder, and though the clamor carried on for a few more seconds, it died quickly under the shock of his wrath. His wooden chair tumbled over as he jolted upright, landing with a clatter on the floor, and both of Sean's hands were balled into veiny fists at his sides. I'd never seen him so angry, and it sent a terrified ripple through my soul. He raised a hand that trembled with barely contained rage, and jabbed it at the crowd, most of his fire directed at the New Wilderness side. This is not some high school auditorium. You will sit down and act like adults, or so help me, I will cut all rations for a week straight. Are we clear? Waves of disgruntled whispers traveled through the group, while the guards breathed appreciative sighs, but none of them dared challenge him. Chris wiped the sweat from his forehead, and Jamie continued the war on her lower lip, biting hard enough I saw her wince as she accidentally drew blood. I let out a long, slow breath of relief, but couldn't get comfortable for the tension that remained in the air. Sean righted his chair and sat back down, after which Adam tapped his gavel with an exhausted grimace in our direction. While I understand such sympathy, Mr. Decker, I'm afraid it does not change the facts at hand. As we've received a confession from the defendant, all other arguments are irrelevant. Out of our good graces, we can allow the jury to decide on a verdict, but if Miss Lonson admits to her crimes, then there is not much more we can do. Chris frowned and seemed to freeze on the spot, his eyes traveling to Jamie, who only Renette his look with a knowing sadness. She would let it happen, I realized, and a cold rush of horror seized me at the knowledge that Chris had run out of ideas. No. I found myself on my feet, and darted before the assembly with emotion clogged in my voice. Please, I don't want to press charges. I was the one she kidnapped, and I don't want her to be punished for it. Doesn't my vote count for anything? Eve's pixie-like face crumpled into a remorseful wince. Hannah, please, we're doing everything I'm begging you. Hands clasped as if in prayer, I moved forward until 2 gun-toting rangers stepped in my way to hold me back, mere feet from the 2 judges. You can't do this. I'll do anything you want. Just don't. Strong arms pulled me away from the guards, and Chris whispered in my ear, his fervent breath hot on my clammy neck. You have to stop. This isn't helping. Sit down. Don't tell me what to do. Angry, confused, and hurt, I turned on him and searched his face through a curtain of my own tears. You said you were going to defend her. And you're making it worse. He scowled and walked me to the table with a firm grip on my arm. I told you to trust me. If you make a scene, it's not going to win anyone over. Livid at being shunted aside, at being treated like some porcelain doll on a shelf, I opened my mouth to utter a retort, but another voice cut in, he's right. I looked down to see Jamie stare back at me from her handcuffs, a deep remorse etched in her features that made the attempt at a smile all the more pitiful. It's going to be okay, Hannah. She arched her head at my abandoned chair, and Jamie blinked hard at moisture that brimmed in her eyelids. You have to wait, okay? Let him do this. Stunned, I slouched back into my chair, my brain a shredded mess of feeling. On one hand, I wanted to slap almost everyone in that room, perhaps even Chris at this point, though I doubted I would ever have mustered the courage to do so. On the other hand, I knew the humiliated sting of shame. I'd been the one to lose my cool, after my silent judgment of the rowdy people. And now had no more room to judge. I'd let my feelings get the better of me, and if Chris was right, then I hadn't improved our position, but only damaged it. Still, I couldn't stifle the sensations inside me, the helpless, bitter anger at the unfairness of our situation. Jamie didn't deserve this. Chris didn't either. The jury would like to ask the defendant a question. One of the men in the jury seats raised his hand, and at Adam's nod, he looked to Jamie. Isn't it true that you served under Rodney Carter as one of his interior guards? Jamie shut her eyes for a moment, as if steeling herself against a wave of nausea. Yes. And isn't it true that, in that role, you were responsible for the arrests and deaths of multiple people? The juror, like the others in their seating area, scribbled on a small wooden clipboard they'd each been given to take notes with. Her voice cracked, and Jamie hung her head in shame. I was. From his chair next to me, Chris leapt to his feet with speed, and worry crawled across his face at how the hall whispered. The defense objects to these questions, Your Honor, they bear no standing on the case at hand. You would say that. One of the women in the jury box, a long-nosed girl who I recognized as one of the former kitchen workers, glowered at Chris. Wasn't she your girlfriend during the Carter regime? Everyone saw you two together, we all knew. Rage boiled like steam in my skull. And I gripped the sides of my chair to keep from launching myself at her. If it weren't for Chris and Jamie, you wouldn't even be here, you ungrateful hag. To his credit, Chris didn't shy from the attack, but his even-keeled tone was laced with venom. I don't think that's inappropriate, we'd like an answer. The lead juror spat with a coldness to his voice that drew sympathetic cheers from the hall and folded two hairy arms over his chest. No. Jamie straightened her back, a rare fury in her eyes as she watched the jurors. Actually, he wasn't. Chris and I ended our relationship due to my employment in the Guard. And was that before, or after the uprising? One of the Ark River folk leaned forward, his stance less antagonistic. They knew of our history, had heard it firsthand from our people, and they weren't stupid. My guts churned behind the defense table, and the anger slid away to be replaced by dread. It was like watching an avalanche in real time, unable to move out of its path, and I wondered if the pain in my heart would kill me. Lie. Just lie, one of you, both of you. If you tell them the truth, they'll never listen to another thing you say. Jamie and Chris locked eyes for a second, and Chris let out a defeated sigh. After. Sneers and exasperated sighs filled the room, the new wilderness jurors looking smug as they sat back in their seats. My own chest deflated. And I squeezed both eyes shut, wishing I could vanish. I didn't want to admit it to myself, didn't want to say the words, even under my breath, but already, I knew, we were losing. Still crimson around his movie star face, Sean rose from behind the prosecution table and waved to gain Adam's attention. As the head of the prosecution, I would like to move that all questions for the defendant either come from our team or the defense, Your Honor. In fact, per our agreement, the jury has no place asking questions of the defendant at all. These comments by the jury are only impeding justice, as they have no bearing on the situation. Pardon us, prosecutor, but they seem to have quite a bit to do with it. Another Ark River juror spoke up, a woman with her golden hair in a tight bun, and she angled her pencil at Jamie. If the defendant has a personal relationship with the head of your security service, especially after her spotty record in the previous administration, you don't think as the base commander that it could have some bearing on her later actions? If this attitude is what we are to expect from both prosecution and defense, I think the jury needs to play a more active role if the truth is to come out at all. His jaw clenched in frustration, but Sean glanced at Chris, and Chris made a slight, barely imperceptible nod. I was unaware of their personal situation at the time. Sean spat the words at the jury, as if he hadn't planned on such animosity from them, despite being nominally in the prosecution. But I know Decker stood up to Carter's regime and was slated to be killed for it. I also know Lonson refused to pull the trigger when given the order. So, her loyalties lay more with Mr. Decker than her own commander? Another Ark Riverman tapped his pencil on his clipboard with a shake of disapproval to his blonde head. He hadn't even bothered to return to his seat this time, and Chris pointed an accusatory finger at the jury. Your Honor, I make a motion for mistrial. The jury is clearly biased against the defendant. And the defense has clearly been sleeping with the defendant. One of the female New Wilderness jurors quipped, and a rumble of agreement shook the hall. Your Honor. Above the chaos, Jamie's voice rang out, loud and clear. I want to speak. If you wish. Adam nodded at Jamie and narrowed his toffee-colored eyes at the jury. I ask that the jury hold your words in equal regard with the charges, as is their sworn duty in the interests of neutrality. You have the floor, Miss Lonson. Jamie swallowed and turned her head to look at me. My heart twinged, and I remembered the first time I'd opened my eyes to see her and Chris watching over me in that pile of moldy shoes, how she'd come to check up on me at the clinic, or when she took me in as her new roommate. Jamie had always been there for me, and now, I couldn't do anything to protect her. Tears threatened to overwhelm me, and I mouthed the only words I could think of, I'm sorry. For the briefest of moments, a flicker of her old grin came back, and Jamie gave a slight shake of her bleach blonde head. Don't be, swiveling to meet the stern eyes of the jury stand, she drew a shuddery breath. I know that I'm guilty. You do too. There's no point contesting that. But even when Chris and I were together, he never agreed with my service in the Guard. Many of you can remember him smuggling food to you, breaking curfew for you, doing everything he could to get himself killed, all to keep New Wilderness alive. He ended things with me when the uprising was over and has always been loyal to what it was all about. Christopher Decker can be hard-headed, pretentious, even rash at times, but he's no traitor. I thought you wished to speak in your defense? One of the Ark River jurors reclined in his chair with a confused note to his voice. Right. Jamie dropped her gaze to her own tattered knees with a contemplative expression. As for myself, I never agreed to hurt anyone, and never would have cooperated if I'd known what O'Brien had planned. I stood in the fire brigade lines with the rest of you the night those rockets came down and did everything I could to get those kids out of the burning cabin. I went to stop O'Brien the night of the siege because I knew she wasn't going to get Hannah back like she told me she would if we handed the beacon over. She saw me coming though, and a thin trickle of crystalline poured down her right cheek, and Jamie forced the words out with a sniffle. And one of our rangers, Andrew Hopman, was killed chasing her down. In my head, I heard again the gunshot that took his life, saw his face white with pain, felt the cold pistol shoved into my hands. My fault. It had all been my fault, not hers. I'll never forgive myself, not as long as I live. Andrew meant everything to me. The trickle became a flood, tears cascading down her freckled face. But Jamie, hell. Her sobs in check to continue. Hannah's life means everything to me. What happened that night was my fault, but I didn't ever want it to be this way. All I wanted was to save her, and there was only one way to do that. I am a traitor, but everything I did for New Wilderness. Silence reigned, as the entirety of the hall looked to the judges to see what they would do. The prosecution couldn't bring themselves to look at Jamie, Sandra wiping her eyes in regret, Ethan glaring at his hands in clear disdain for the whole process. Sean's broad shoulders were slumped, as if he were the one on trial, and beside me, Chris reached for my hand in shaky reflex. I clung to him, too nervous at this pivotal moment to be angry about earlier. Please don't, please. His gaze drifted to the large Bible on the table in front of him, and Adam only looked to the jury after nearly a minute of unmoving reflection. Is the jury satisfied with the defendant's testimony? After a few whispers among themselves, the lead juror nodded. "We are, Your Honor." Adam leaned back in his regal chair, and Eve couldn't seem to help herself, slipping a hand into her husband's grasp. Here, at the end of the horrible process at last, Adam's countenance slid into another hardened impassiveness, as if he too awaited the inevitable. "And how do you find the defendant?" Not a person in the hall moved, the thick air heavy with the interest of hundreds of ears. "Guilty, Your Honor." "No," I choked, unable to scream, my jaw slack in horrified shock. Chris's eyes lost any glint they might have had, and all the rigid pride went out of Jamie's stiff form. The hall erupted in roars, mostly of triumphant jeers, enough to ram home the terrible ache within my ribs. Adam banged his gavel with more than a little bitterness to his swings and rose with his wife to their feet. "Jamie Lonson, I find you're guilty of all charges. In the sight of God, I am forced to pass sentence." Jamie covered her face with both manacled hands, and I caught the way her shoulders quaked, her weeping almost to where she couldn't hold it in. However, Adam glanced at his wife, whose eyes shone in desperate agreement. "We are commanded by the holy word to show mercy, as we have been shown it, and so I put your fate in the hands of the supreme judge of the universe. As punishment for your crimes, come dawn, you shall hereby be banished forever from all lands belonging to our people. Should you ever return, you will be killed on sight according to the ancient tradition of the first murderer, Cain. May you find forgiveness in Adonai's grace." His gavel was drowned out by thunderous voices, either screaming in protest at what they considered a light sentence or cheering in support. I didn't need to hear it though. From how Chris sat back in his chair, still as a statue in defeat, I knew it was over. Without the sturdy walls of a fortress settlement to protect her, and all on her own, Jamie wouldn't last a month, much less until victory over our enemies was obtained. Mercy or no, this was still the same dark fate I dreaded. This was a death sentence. The doors to the church opened, the rangers moved in to keep the hysterical crowds at bay, and I watched in terror as they lead Jamie outside. In my head, I heard Ethan's words over again. I went back to check, found his boots with the feet still in them.
Until next time, subscribe to stay up to date with all updates. No screamers or shocking moments, only comfort and safety. Bye.